All right, welcome into another edition of the Musketeer Report podcast. It is Thursday, November 14th. Paul Fritchner is not with me. He is headed down to Charleston to call some Division One games, do play-by-play on TV or streaming, I believe. So looking forward to hearing him do that. We'll send out the links. I believe it's all on YouTube there. So we'll make sure to get those links out. Congrats to Paul on that opportunity. But Xavier beat IU Indy 94-80 and Jackson State 94-57 since we last talked to you guys a week ago. The Musketeers will take on Wake Forest on Saturday at noon on FS1 in their first real test of the season. We'll talk more about that game as this show goes along. But first, I want to start off talking just a little bit about the last two games that we saw and some of what's been talked about on the message board at musketeerreport.com. I guess starting with the concern about Xavier not covering the expected margin of victory in the first two games. I think it's a legitimate concern because that's why you scheduled those games. But there's no way about that. That is exactly why Xavier scheduled Jackson State and IU Indy. They wanted to beat them by a lot of points. And, obviously they didn't accomplish that in the first two games, but they did against Jackson State. I think people are going too far overboard with this concept, though. Like I've seen people talking about that Xavier didn't care about that because Sean Miller was playing his backups during that game. Well, yeah, like Sean Miller is still going to coach his team. There are other objectives other than just covering the spread and trying to boost your predictive metrics. But that doesn't mean that's not why they scheduled those games. They are attempting to boost their predictive metrics, and they feel like that's how things worked last year for the Big 12, and it helped them out. I think it's arguable how much that actually helped the Big 12, but I'm not really here to argue against that. I can just tell you that is why Xavier and many other teams this year scheduled the way that they did, looking to play some of the worst teams from a predictive metric standpoint to try to boost their own metrics. And I would just say the bottom line about all of this is that people don't understand the metrics. They love them when they work in their favor. They hate them when they don't, and they say that they don't make sense. As long as Xavier wins some big games against quality competition, then this isn't something that you guys are really going to have to worry much about. The metrics will take care of themselves. It's more a concern for Xavier if it comes down to the bubble and the cut line and they're bouncing around in that territory. Then you'll get a little bit more concerned about what they did in these bye games and how much it impacted their metrics. But let's look at some positive takeaways and then maybe some of the concerns from the last few games or the first three games. And again, I think all of this has to be taken with a grain of salt because we're talking about three bye games against some of the teams that are expected to be among the worst in the country. So in terms of the positives, we'll start with ball movement and three-point shooting, I think, is where I would go first and foremost. That was something we talked a lot about this offseason. With the players that Xavier brought in, they're really expected to be a better offensive team. They're expected to look different with the way they move the ball on the perimeter and their emphasis on three-point shooting. And I think we've already seen that, and it's looked good. They rank second in the country in assist percentage, and they're shooting 44.4% from deep, which is good for 17th in the country. So all of that has been exactly what you were hoping for from a fan's perspective to this point. Also, taking care of the basketball. They've been really good in that department too. They're not giving it away. They're not wasting possessions. They're not getting flustered by pressure defenses. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to two things, really. One, they have a number of ball handlers on this team. Yeah, it starts with having an experienced, competent point guard in Davion McKnight, but Ryan Conwell has played the point guard position. Then off the bench, you have Trey Green, who has been a point guard throughout his career. And also Dante Maddox Jr. has played a lot of point guard in his career. So all of those guys have handled the ball. They're comfortable making decisions and handling pressure. And then you also have guys like Dalen Swain, Marcus Foster, bigger wings who aren't go-to ball handlers, but when they grab a defensive rebound, they're very good at leading the break. And in the half court, they can handle the ball without giving it away, essentially. Same thing with Zach Fremantle. I would put him in that group in the half court where he's not turning it over a lot. He can handle the ball on the perimeter, turn the corner himself if he needs to. So they just have a skilled team. And then the second part of that is just the experience of all these guys. They value possessions. They understand that you can't win games if you're giving the ball away and leading to easy points on the other end of the court. So that's been a major positive so far for this team as well. In terms of individuals, I think, there are definitely some concerns about the front court of this team and the rebounding as we go along and they play better competition. But so far, Zach Freemantle, Dalen Swain, and Marcus Foster have been pretty impressive on the defensive glass. And I think that was something that you needed to see through these first 3 games, especially after Lassina Traore went down with his knee injury, because that definitely becomes a question mark for this group. And again, it all still needs to be proven against legit competition going forward. But at least through these first few games, I liked what I saw from those guys trying to make up for some of that lack of size in the lineup and that lack of rebounding potentially. Also, I thought John Hughley took a step forward in the Jackson State game. John obviously hasn't been up to providing them a lot of production in the first few games, and it was questionable, I think, if he'd be able to give them much of anything after you saw him in the season opener. But he's clearly making strides, and Sean Miller talked positively about him after that Jackson State game and said, they can see it coming. He still puts that timeline on late December, early January for when we can expect to see John Hughley playing better basketball, really looking like himself or what they expect him to look like. And that's not easy to hear as a fan, I don't think, especially when you're going to be relying on him for minutes in your non-conference schedule throughout the course of the next 2 months. But I think it's good that Sean has the confidence to stick with him. They're not looking to just eliminate that part of their bench and go small all the time and just play a different way. They still believe in what John Hughley can give them. And again, you saw strides against Jackson State. I think when he saw that baseline jumper go down and then that next bucket a few possessions later go in, I think that gave him some confidence, and that kind of turned his motor up a little bit. It made him look better in other areas of his game aside from just scoring. But he's also getting fouled a lot on the offensive end. And that's something that Xavier's offense is designed to do. It's designed to work the ball into the post and draw quick fouls on the opposition. And last year, they couldn't really do much of that because they didn't have a legitimate post threat down there. John Hughley can be that for them. Now, he still has to play better in other areas, but he already has the hands, the footwork, the scoring capability, and he obviously has the size that if they can get him on the court long enough, I think he can rack up some fouls against the other team. And that not only gets him to the free throw line where he's good at knocking down free throws, but it also puts some foul pressure on the other team in terms of, this guy's now in foul trouble. Do you have to take him out of the game and go with the smaller lineup? Changes the way they play, maybe makes them a little bit less aggressive. Also makes their defense focus more on defending the paint and defending inside as opposed to putting all that pressure extended out on Xavier's shooters. So that's definitely something that you want to see continue to progress as we go forward here throughout the non-conference schedule and get closer to that timeline that Sean Miller keeps throwing out there of January when John Hughley will really be ready. All right, now let's look at some of the concerns from the first few games. And I would just start with kind of what I've already been talking about, slowing down high major front court players. I think we've already seen some of that. Zach Freemantle definitely upgrades your front court from last year. He gives you a real threat on the offensive end, and he's rebounding well defensively, but he's not a good defender in terms of stopping guys. He's not offering a lot of resistance. We've already seen that against some of the post players they've played, and obviously that doesn't match up to some of the guys that are still to come when they get into Big East play. So that's something I have my eye on. And then just the defense in general. I mean, allowing opponents to shoot over 40% from three is alarming. Now, it's just 3 bye games. I don't think they've been their sharpest. I think they will get better. I'm not too worried about that yet, but it's definitely something that makes you take notice and something you'll watch going forward about, will they be able to tighten up this perimeter defense? I still put the front court defense as a bigger concern than the lack of perimeter defense and the struggles to defend the 3-point shot. But overall, the defense is something that seems to be a bit of a question mark still for this team. And, maybe it really will be a team that just has to outscore all of its opposition. And that's something that we talked about throughout the offseason when they were making the moves that they did in the transfer portal. The final thing that I would bring up is just that the fact that right now, I think there are really only 3 reliable scorers for this team. It feels like there's a big 3 kind of emerging. And obviously that's Ryan Conwell, Zach Freemantle, and Davion McKnight. Yes, there are other guys who can give you a big scoring night. And there are guys that can shoot the 3 like Dante Maddox and Trey Green coming off the bench that can give you that microwave scoring ability. But if you're really talking about you're going into a big game like the Crosstown Shootout, or you're playing against UConn on the road in Big East play, who can you rely on? Who do you think is going to be able to step up in that environment and be a go-to scoring option for you, or give you like a 15-point game? There's only 3 reliable guys that you can say that about right now. Hopefully, as the season goes on, there'll be more of them. But I think that I thought that there would be at least 1 or 2 others. Maybe Dalen Swain would already be at that point. And, he's close. He has his moments for sure. But I don't think there's also been periods of the games where he has faded away, especially on the offensive end, and hasn't been able to give them much of a lift there. I think a Marcus Foster, a Dante Maddox Jr., even a Trey Green, all of those guys were ones that I thought might be capable of giving them that 4th and 5th scoring options regularly. So far, that hasn't come to fruition, but I still think it's a legitimate possibility for this team. So we'll keep our eye on that as we go forward. But the next game coming up is that Saturday tip-off. It's a noon game at the Cintas Center against Wake Forest, and I've actually got a guest coming in to help me break that down. He is our 24/7 site beat writer for Wake Forest, Demon Deacon Digest. His name is Les Johns. So let's get into that interview right now. All right, joining me now for this is Les Johns to break down this Wake Forest Xavier matchup. Les, thanks for doing this. First of all, I really appreciate you joining me.
Oh, thrilled to be on, Rick. Nice to meet you here virtually, and looking forward to seeing you Saturday.
Yeah, should be a good game. First test for this Xavier team. Wake Forest has already played Michigan, so you've already got the chance to see the Demon Deacons against a legit matchup. Let's start off with the fact that this Wake Forest team was picked to finish 3rd this year in the ACC. What are the vibes like around the program after this 4-0 start, where they have the big win over Michigan last week, but then the close call against USC upstate this week? Is the fan base pretty excited about this group right now, or is there some concern?
Yes. The easy answer is yes. How message boards are, obviously, Rick. People are very excited and concerned all at the same time. They see some flaws early on. One of the biggest struggles for the Deeks early on through these first 4 games, they're just not shooting the ball well. They're struggling behind the arc, and it's manifesting itself even in guys that are normally reliable shooters. Hunter Salas is not connecting behind the arc. Parker Fredrickson, basically, he's known as a sharpshooter, one of the top scorers of all time from Oklahoma High School, is not finding the bottom of the net behind the arc. So it's one of those weird things that they just hit a decent amount of 3-point shots. The margin on some of those games against lesser opponents would look better, but they haven't. There's been some turnovers. There's been a lot of missed threes. And we're still kind of seeing Hunter Salas, transform into more of a point guard instead of an off guard. And that's an experiment that's still, not up in the air, but he's still got a lot to prove.
You mentioned Hunter Salas, and I love his game. I love watching him play. He was a preseason first-team All-ACC selection. Can you describe his game a little bit for the fans who maybe haven't seen him play? Like, what really makes him stand out?
Well, what makes him stand out is his motor, the fact that he can contribute at all 3 levels. He can take it all the way to the rack. He's usually reliable behind the arc. He can distribute and make plays for others, but he's got a nasty pull-up game. When he wants to get a shot like between 8 to 12 feet out, he can pretty much get that at will, and he can elevate and shoot over others who are scrambling to defend him, moving laterally. I'd say his pull-up is probably the most most unique. I know that's an oxymoron or a double. You're not supposed to use that, but that's the most unique part of his game is the fact that he can drive into the paint and pull up and shoot over you. That's not something you see as much these days. Most time people get it all the way to the 10 or they shoot behind the arc. But he has no problems between 8 to 12 feet and will make people pay.
Yeah, that part of his game is certainly NBA quality. People always talk about it's a lost art. And I say, well, it's a lost art for the lower levels. If you watch the best players in the world, they're usually really good at those things. And he is on that level in terms of the mid-range. Trayvon Spillers is another guy I wanted to ask you about. He's averaging a double-double with 13 points and 10 rebounds per game right now. Xavier is a team that I think everyone is a little concerned about the front court, partially because of last year's struggles. They've totally revamped it to a new group of guys, but then before the season started this year, they lost their starting center, or the guy they thought that was going to be their starting center, in Lucina Traore, a transfer from Long Beach State. So there's some consternation about their ability to defend the post and also to rebound in the post. What's Trayvon Spillers' game like?
I know Traore was a highly sought after transfer commit too, so that's a big loss for the Musketeers. Spillers is the Energizer Bunny. You know, he does a lot of little things well. He hammers the boards. He affects shots defensively, and he's got a sneaky good shot behind the arc, as we've seen early on this season. You know, he's probably one of the better performers so far for Wake Forest from shooting the three, which is not what one would expect. But I think he only attempted 2 last season for Appalachian State. So to see him be able to expand his range is kind of fun to see. Works hard, like I said, battles in the paint, and doesn't take a play off.
And then the other double-digit scorer in this lineup is Cam Hildreth at 11 points per game. What does he bring to the table?
An unorthodox game at times. He'll take the ball into the paint, especially in transition, and somehow get shots up over 2 or 3 defenders that you just can't figure out how he got it off and got it through the net. Really hard, a tough defender, and that's something that Wake Forest has done better this season, is play kind of hard-nosed man-to-man defense. Efton Reed's kind of the guy in the middle that kind of anchors that defense, not only as a rim protector, and I know you didn't ask about Efton, but he's also a great communicator for that defense. He's constantly talking, constantly getting guys in the right spot, and sometimes, you know, cleaning up mistakes. But Cam Hildreth is probably the top perimeter defender. He usually guards the toughest matchup for the opposing team, and at the same time, he contributes big time offensively. So, yeah.
You talked already about Trayvon and how he's a little bit more of like a hustle guy doing the dirty work. Efton Reed, he's big, tall, big presence inside. How much do they actually use him on the offensive end as a post-up option?
Well, they like him as a post-op option, and they went to him early last night in the win over USC Upstate. They like to see the offense kind of go through him at times because he has soft hands and he can pass when doubled. And when you don't double him, he can usually back down, and he's got a variety of low post moves. He's a big part of what they're trying to do offensively this season. Yeah, so far so good. He can also occasionally pop one behind the arc, but I think Coach Forbes is wanting him to more patrol the paint on offense instead of wandering out behind the arc. But yeah, he's a good weapon.
We were talking about Xavier's injury with Lucina Traore. Obviously, there's an injury on the Wake Forest side as well. Omaha Blue is out 8 to 10 weeks with a foot injury. How big of a deal is that for the Deacs?
I mean, Coach Forbes has said multiple times over the last couple of years that you don't suddenly unbecome a McDonald's All-American. So, I mean, Omaha arrived at Wake Forest with a lot of talent and potential that had yet to be untapped. And he showed signs of being an impact player in the few minutes we saw him for Wake Forest. He played a combined 40 minutes in his first 3 games coming off the bench. He was on a little bit of a pitch count as he was coming back from injury that actually got re-aggravated in the season, the second game, I believe. It's a loss. It's a big loss, but it's kind of one of those things that we probably don't realize right in this moment how significant the loss will be because he was only playing 15, 16 minutes a game. But he was doing really good things, and he showed signs. He kind of sparked him a bit in the win over Michigan. He gave some really good minutes in. Yeah, it's a loss, and I know that the team hated to see that happen, but they believe getting a little procedure done to clean that foot up and having him come back more full strength in 8 to 10 weeks is better than him trying to go through the season, not quite 100%. So, yeah.
He would have been one of the reserve options in the post, likely. So what does their post step look like without him now?
Yeah, the post step looks a little bit different. They'll probably go a little bit smaller. They've got Juke Harris coming off the bench, who plays primarily the 3. Trayvon Spillers, like you said, is starting at the 4. They're just now working Churchill Abbess into some playing time. He was slow with an injury over the summer. He got a few minutes last night. Big body in the middle that can play either the 4 or the 5. So it's definitely damaged in terms of depth, but they believe they've got what they need to get some wins.
All right, what went right in the win over Michigan, and what went wrong in the close call against USC Upstate?
You're thinking the Deacs should have won by more than 5 last night?
I mean, well, I'll leave that open to your interpretation.
They were only favored by 26, Rick. I mean, yeah, geez. What went right was they definitely fed off the momentum of the crowd. They didn't let an early deficit prevent them from continuing to work hard and to play hard and give maximum effort. I believe they also played exceptional defense. They made a run late in the first half where they had 3 or 4 kills, and Wake Forest qualifies that as 3 stops in a row. I think every team probably has a vernacular for that same thing. Yeah. Coach Manning before called it turkey, but I think kill sounds a little bit more intimidating.
You'll actually see Xavier has a kill counter graphic on one of their video boards in the arena.
There you go. So, yeah. There you go. So Wake got 3 kills down the stretch and had the lead down to 1 until Michigan hit like a half-court buzzer beater defended to put it back up to 4 at the half. But then they continued in the second half and built off that defensive effort. So I'd say it started on defense, and then they got a good lift from Omaha off the bench. They got a great lift from Juke Harris off the bench. He's already, as a freshman, making a big impact for the Deacs, and he can do a variety of things well. He shoots well from the perimeter. He's like a lanky 6'7" guard wing. He can get to the basket, defends reasonably well, and has a really good basketball IQ. He's someone to watch Saturday afternoon. But yeah, they had a couple guys give them a good spell off the bench, and they played good tough defense and didn't let the early deficit get the best of them. What went wrong last night, I would say, is poor shooting again. Like they've shot in the mid-20s behind the arc in all 4 games this season. Last night was no different. They probably let their offensive woes affect their defense, where they weren't as stingy defensively. And then sometimes when you let a team like USC Upstate kind of hang around, they get more confidence as the game progresses. Once you don't play closeout defense early and they get some shots to fall, they gain some confidence, realize they can play with the favorite, and all of a sudden you're locked in a nip and tuck game all the way down the stretch. That's probably what happened, but I think it comes down to defense. And Coach Forbes believes, whereas they've been really strong offensively the last 2 or 3 seasons and maybe not where they needed to be defensively, he believes this team can play better defense, is more athletic, can be more disruptive, has a little bit more size, a little bit more toughness, and he believes defense and rebound travels, and that they'll do better on the road. And I guess we'll start to see that for the first time Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, and I think we saw that with this team through the first 3 games. It was just a little bit different in that USC Upstate matchup where they maybe weren't as sharp. Les, we'll wrap it up with this. Are there any interesting storylines emerging about this team that I've missed here?
Interesting storylines. I mean, I guess it's just, once again, Coach Forbes seems to have hit in the transfer portal. That's kind of been his MO over the last 3 or 4 years. He gets 1 or 2 quality guys. And I guess maybe even the bigger story is the amount of guys who returned. Wake actually, despite getting a couple what they believe are hits on the transfer portal, have, I think the number was a 53% minutes continuity from by Ken Palm. So, they got Cam Hildreth to come back. Efton Reed is back. Parker Fredrickson is back. And most importantly, Hunter Salas, who went through the NBA draft process and decided in the final day to come back for one more season at Wake Forest. So they've got a lot of returners. They've got some key transfers in the mix. And Wake actually enters this season with expectations, which isn't something we've seen in Winston-Salem for quite a long time. I've been covering the team since 2014. And I believe this might be the only time I've seen them with actual expectations. So we'll see how they handle that as the season goes on. But they've got a lot of returning depth, returning talent who have a lot of experience. So I think they're equipped to handle it.
All right, good stuff. That is Les Johns from our Wake Forest 24/7 site. Les, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Glad to be on, Rick. Thanks for having me. See you Saturday.
All right, that's it for this edition of the Musketeer Report podcast. Appreciate Les for joining me here for a few minutes to talk about the Wake Forest Xavier game. Appreciate all you guys for watching or listening to this, however you're consuming it, and we'll talk more about it on the message board.